Okay, so here's the footprint lecture that I promised in the previous video. Um, so I'm going to talk about specifically the footprint of busing to Luanda versus flying, but I'm also going to bring up a few general points, wider points about footprints. So in a way, this is kind of an entry point for understanding a few things about footprints, carbon footprints. As I explained earlier, I think this is interesting. There's a kind of geeky fun to working out footprint values. But it's also important because we do need to reduce our footprints in the interests of sustainability. Um, Obviously, not everything is about individuals. A lot is about government. We also need to know a lot about what governments should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing to kind of guide us when we, for example, when we vote. But still, I don't think one should heap everything on government and things beyond oneself. We do have, especially people like myself, who have relatively high footprints and come from parts of society where we can afford to have relatively high footprints. We really need to watch our emissions. Um, yeah, it's about building awareness. This is quite related to other consumption responsibility issues. Now, especially now, we're seeing a lot of interest in where you buy imported products, for example. Are you buying from countries that bomb other countries, or where human rights are not respected? The thing that you're consuming was produced by somebody who doesn't have the kinds of rights that workers in your own country have. This is part of that kind of consumption responsibility area. So, yeah, why aren't there more people worrying about footprints and looking into the numbers? Well, I think, even if you're not a climate change denialist, it's very easy to just, kick the can down the road and think, oh, I'll get into this later, or my children will deal with this. These things are not going to hit us immediately. But I think a lot of people would like to focus more on their carbon footprint, but find it difficult to do because everything seems so confusing. So I've spent a lot of time looking at carbon footprint calculators on the web. They can give you quite different results, and I find it quite frustrating. Often these calculators are applicable only to a certain kind of person in a certain country, and the calculators will kind of not give you a lot of background information. They won't have like documentation on how they do their calculations, and they're also not very clear about where do we know more, where do we know less. For certain things, it's quite clear what your emissions are. For other things, for various technical scientific reasons, it's less clear. And so, ideally one needs to think of ranges. My footprint is probably within this range, but then again, we don't like ranges. We want precise figures. I think there's room for some organization, who knows, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, to invest in web-based facilities with very, very authoritative and easy to use tools, well, or of different levels of complexity. Some people want something that's very simple. Some people want something that's going to give them more information, that's going to be more educational. Okay, now to this trip and the carbon footprint associated with it, or the carbon savings associated with it. So yeah, a basic geographical fact is that we are going to take buses over about 3,500 kilometers, whereas if you fly, it's 2,500 kilometers because you fly in a straight line, and maybe the bus routes are not the most direct we could have. With better infrastructure, maybe the distance would be shorter. In fact, the kind of the most convenient way to do the first part of our trip, which is from Pretoria/Johannesburg to Windhoek, is via Intercape and via Uppington. But that's quite a long ride. It just doesn't make sense in a way not to go through Botswana. Botswana makes the route a lot shorter, but there's no direct bus. There used to be. It stopped during the pandemic. So now it's a bit more difficult to go through Botswana, but we thought we're gonna take the challenge of going through Botswana, even if it's kind of less convenient. We don't know exactly. Well, we don't have tickets for most of that trip, so we're going to work it out as we move along. Yeah, so 3,500. It would have been longer if we'd gone the kind of convenient route through Uppington, but we wanted to reduce the footprint. So I'm going to start with what the flight to Luanda would mean in terms of its footprint, and then go to buses and see what the difference is. So a flight to Luanda from Johannesburg is associated with about 500 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Now, what does all of this mean? Well, 500 kilograms, I think, is clear. Carbon dioxide is this gas that we exhale, and that's not a very large part of the atmosphere, but even small changes affect the climate, and that's why we have climate change. But it's 500 kilograms of carbon dioxide or CO2 equivalent emissions. What does the equivalent mean? It means that not only has carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas been counted, but also other gases, and there are conversion factors so that one takes other gases, let's say methane. Now, a kilo of methane actually has a much larger effect on the climate than a kilo of carbon dioxide. So you have to have a conversion factor to convert a kilo of methane to its equivalent impact in terms of carbon dioxide. In the case of aviation, it seems like nitrogen oxide is quite important. So that's a non-CO2 greenhouse gas that needs to be converted to CO2 values. If you take out the other gases, if you only look at carbon dioxide, then the emissions for that Johannesburg to Luanda flight, when we're talking about one person, is about 266 kilograms of CO2, 266. But it becomes 500 when you then count other gases converted to CO2 terms. Now, 500 kilograms of CO2, in some ways it's a bit difficult to imagine it because CO2 is a gas. How do you think of the mass of gas? Well, it would be the carbon dioxide emitted from 5 tanks of a small car. So a 40-liter tank times 5, that's about 500 kilometers of just carbon dioxide emissions. So that gives you a sense, 5 tanks of a small car to get to Luanda. So the sources for what I'm talking about now will be in a document that I'm going to make available on my blog. I just need to finalize that. And of course, there are things that are debatable. In all of these things, you get slightly different numbers depending on where you look. But I thought that the sources that I found seemed pretty reliable. In fact, it's easier to work out the emissions associated with flying than emissions associated with travel by bus, because a lot of these calculators focus on high emissions activities. They don't really pay that much attention to lower emissions activities, but we want to know what those bus trips mean in terms of emissions, because we want to know the difference between flying and the bus. So yeah, I mean, the emissions of your bus depends on things like how full the bus is, and often buses are not as full as aeroplanes. The speed, planes travel roughly at a predictable speed, whereas buses can travel at different speeds depending on the weather, the terrain, and so on. But using the best I could find within a few hours got me to 81 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, bus ride, Pretoria to Luanda, 3,500 kilometers. So it means that the flight would cause a footprint that is 6 times larger than the bus trip. The difference in terms of kilos is 420 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emission. So that's a saving, 420. To put that in some context, the 420, the average person in the US emits 17 tons or 17,000 kilos of CO2 equivalent emissions. In South Africa, it's 6,000 kilos, goes down to 2,000 kilos. Within Malawi, of course, these are averages, and in unequal societies, such as South Africa, such as the United States, different people's emissions are very, very different. And there's been an increasing focus on within country inequalities with respect to emissions. The figures that I've just mentioned, the national averages, are perhaps a bit different from what you've heard, and that would be because I'm using consumption-based per capita emissions figures here and not territorial. There's an important distinction between the two. So territorial calculations, territorial-based calculations of emissions look at the emissions happening, say, within South Africa, all of the emissions, companies, the energy sector, transport, etc., cement, and then gets a CO2 equivalent figure, and then you divide that by the population. It's relatively easy to do. Well, relatively. I mean, if you look at the IPCC manuals on what each country needs to do in order to produce its annual, I don't think it's annual, but its periodic greenhouse gas inventory. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into that, but still, it's easier relative to the consumption-based approach. So in the consumption-based approach, I am looking at not just the territorial emissions, but what emissions are associated with people in, say, South Africa consume. Now, South Africa is an interesting case because the difference between the territorial figure and the consumption-based figure is huge. It's about 40%. It's about 40% higher if you use the territorial figure. Why? Because South Africa has a lot of mineral processing and the whole mining sector is very emissions intensive in South Africa, but a lot of the products coming out of that sector are exported. So South Africans don't consume them. In a way, the emissions happen here so that other countries can benefit from it. Of course, if you're going to do a consumption-based approach, you also need to take into account the fact that South Africa imports things. And if we import things from China, then we have to count the emissions associated with the production of those goods as South Africa's or South Africans' emissions. So, yeah, consumption-based versus territorial emissions. It's important to note that most of the national average statistics that you see are territorial. And that's largely because it's the territorial calculations that are used in the international negotiations, in all of the reporting to the relevant United Nations bodies. The focus is territorial because it's relatively easy to calculate. The consumption-based approach requires quite complex, in addition to what you would need to do for the territorial, you also then need to look at trade flows between all countries and look at the emissions associated with different kinds of goods. And obviously there's a kind of reliability factor there. You have to make assumptions. It's complex. So mainly for that reason, the consumption-based figures aren't used. But I think that ideally they should be used, because if you don't think of this in terms of consumption, you can have a country, for instance, that outsources all of its electricity generation. Let the neighboring country have coal-generated electricity, send it to you on transmission lines, and then you don't count the emissions as yours. That's how the territorial approach works. And obviously you want people to think in terms of their overall consumption. I mean, in many ways, rich countries have outsourced a lot of their emissions to China. So Chinese emissions are, to a fairly large extent, covering goods consumed in the rest of the world. If you want to look into consumption-based figures, there's this wonderful organization called Global Carbon Budget. And they, every year, produce national estimates based using the consumption-based approach. And I've kind of used their work in some of these videos that I did for history teachers on how to bring climate change into the history class. So, okay, so let's go back. South Africa's per capita emissions, about 6,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, and the saving from going by bus instead of flying to Luanda is 420 kilograms. Now, my carbon footprint, because I'm very interested in this, and so I have estimated my carbon footprint. It used to be 5.9 tons, or 5,900 kilograms, so just about the South African average. And then it's gone down to about 4.6 tons, or 4,600 kilograms per year, after I got solar energy, solar panels installed in my home. I'll post details on how I got this. You know, I was actually surprised. I thought my footprint would be higher. I've tried not to exclude anything, but it's possible that I have. But you know, just doing this kind of work, I think is useful and quite empowering. So one of the things that struck me when I did my carbon footprint is, you know, with the, say, 4.6 tons a year that I have as a footprint, about 2.1 of that is flying, private flying, holiday to Cape Town. I have family in Sweden, traveling not every year, but sometimes to Sweden. It works out to about 2.1. So flying, in my case, is almost half of my footprint. I've been able to reduce the rest of my footprint quite considerably. That's where I have leeway. But when it comes to flying, it's very, very difficult, and that's partly why I'm kind of getting into this now. Getting to Sweden in any other way is virtually impossible from South Africa. But on the non-flying side, one has quite a lot of discretion. For example, myself and Imgard try and eat vegan as much as possible, so I've taken that into account. That helps to reduce your footprint. I don't have a car; I have a bicycle. One interesting thing that I like to explain, because it underlines how difficult carbon footprints can be to understand, is, I'll say, what are the emissions associated with going on my bicycle to work? And a lot of people will say, well, of course it's zero, but it's not. It's not zero, because there is fuel, and it's the fuel inside you. It's the food you eat, and you're eating slightly more in order to have fuel to get you from A to B on your bicycle, and that food has a carbon footprint. So it's very difficult to find anything other than singing to yourself that doesn't have some kind of footprint. And incidentally, I've not counted flying for work purposes. So this is an important principle in the carbon footprint world, is that you count your personal activities, not your work activities. Your work activities have to be counted somewhere. So in my case, if I fly around the country to meetings and I work in education, those emissions are the emissions of the education system, and they would be counted as the emissions of people who are consuming education. So if you're doing education, you need to take into account that there's a footprint there. If you go to the dentist, there's a footprint because the equipment that the dentist uses, the training the dentist has been on, all of that carries a footprint. And that footprint is actually attributable to you as the consumer of the dentist's services. So, so let's say I stopped flying. I mean, and I managed to reduce my footprint from, say, 4.9 minus 2.1. That's leaves me with 2.5 kilograms per year. That's pretty low. But would I be out of the red? No, unfortunately not. We actually need to reduce our footprints even further than that. An interesting, a wonderful resource that I would strongly recommend to teachers and others, because things are explained so well, are the recent materials of the World Inequality Database. So this is an organization that was created recently. It's based in France. Thomas Piketty is one of the founding creators of this initiative, and they produce reports from time to time. And their initial focus was income inequality, but increasingly they have focused on inequality with respect to carbon footprints. And the 2022 report of the World Inequality Database has some wonderful sections that explain, I think, as simply as one possibly can, issues around actual emissions values, ideal emissions values, and the ideal that they have put forward, and that which are similar to other ideals, is that I think it's within 15 years, we should all be down to one ton, 1,000 kilograms. Any more than that, and we can't be sure that we are avoiding very serious and possibly catastrophic climate change for not distant generations. The children of today are going to have to handle a lot of the fallout. So yeah, I would highly recommend that report. Yeah, so this is then my contribution. The next video is going to be far more logistical. It's going to be about buses and making sure we get to the bus on time, and whether we're comfortable in the bus, and so on and so forth. See you then. Bye bye.